Secretary-General Amina Mohammed. We also are joined by Achim Steiner, the administrator of the UN Development Program. We have Selwin Hart, the special advisor to the Secretary-General on Climate Action, and Navid Hanif, the Assistant Secretary-General for Economic Development at the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at DESA. They are here this morning to give you a preview of the SDG Summit, of the Climate Ambition Summit, and overall of high-level week that is just upon us. So without further ado, please, DSG, you have the floor.
Great, thank you very much, and good morning to everyone, and the trees are real, just in case anybody's wondering. And the second thing I have to say is that we will be giving you your SDG pins in case you forgot them at home. I was just looking at the first row, and I don't see a single one. But thank you so much for joining us here, and we are really thrilled to be in a place that we can, halfway through the SDGs, put something up that people can, especially stakeholders and our delegations, have a meeting place outside of the halls. There will be lots of time when heads of state and government will be there 1+1 or they're 1+3 or 5, and there'll be many other stakeholders who will want to continue the discussion around halfway through the SDGs. So we're very thankful to those that have contributed to make this happen for us. So what's happening on sustainable development next week? We're going to have leaders and up to 5,000 partners that will be here to mark the midpoint of the SDGs. They'll come not only for the SDG Summit on the Monday, but also the weekend, Saturday and Sunday. All our stakeholders will be here in many different constituencies, from civil society, the private sector, academia, women, and the major stakeholder groups. There'll be a Climate Ambition Summit, and we will have other major meetings on financing for development. We will have 3 on health, and we will have the first of those discussions around what will the Summit of the Future look like, the key elements that will go into that. All of this is seeking to mobilize greater commitment, but also the resources, the ambition that we have always looked for since 2015 and trying to keep that promise, the solidarity and the determination to respond to some of the biggest challenges that we face today. And I know that you hear us often start our speeches with the crises, and absolutely right it is, but we have to find a balance, because what we try to do here is give the hope. And every time you say that, well, we're not going to get the SDGs if we're so far off track, what then are we telling the millions of people who maybe have to think about tomorrow because they can't think any further? We have to continue to get the job done and not fail for want of trying. So why is this also important? We know across the world that we are seeing the massive crises. In fact, in 2 natural disasters that one natural disaster in Morocco, the death toll continues to rise as it does in Libya from the break at the dam. And these are huge. These are the numbers that we are hearing even this morning as we were being reported, over 11,000, going to 20,000 in Libya. It's not, you cannot imagine the figures that we're putting out there. There's a face and families and dependents on every one of these. And so as we look at the more immediate, we do still see our conflicts, our climate, our unconstitutional changes in government, and still the inability for us to come back from the COVID crisis that we had. And we still believe that the best way to prevent and tackle these challenges is the one framework that no one argues with, that everyone can see themselves in, and that the investments are related to every one of those 17 goals in our Sustainable Development Pledge to Agenda 2030. Good for people, good for the planet that we live on. And so that tool is what we try to bring again to unify what has become a fractious world. The tensions are palpable, and that's what we will see in the UNGA, but can we take at least something there that brings us together on common ground on our people and our planet? Halftime, you're all going to be knowing, I mean, from the reports that have come out globally, we see that 15% is what we've been able to do on the targets. It's abysmal. It's a sobering fact that we will come into in the General Assembly. Huge implications for everyone. And it is a failure of ours to tackle global inequalities, our triple planetary crisis. But we do have, and we see more division, and we see the gender equality hundreds of years away, and more displacement and instability around the world. But the week is about turning things around. We've got the tools. What we need to come to is with much more determination with those solutions on how we can get this done. And there are. You will hear from my colleagues, you will hear through the week some of the solutions people have been putting to work, young people, women, but we need the investments to scale them up, to truly make them programs and changes in economies that should be more inclusive. What do we expect to be achieved? First, we really do need a recommitment from all leaders to deliver on the 2015 promise. We need a clear way, because we do see the major barrier as the means of implementation, financing this agenda, be it the domestic resources that are needed, that are under strain with many countries without much fiscal space, but we also, the commitments made by the international community to fund this in the Addis Ababa agreement are falling short. The political declaration, hard to come by, if adopted, it does represent a really strong statement of intent from world leaders. This was not easy, given the struggles that we were having at the same time negotiating the outcome of the G20 declaration. But we think we've got, if this goes through and adopted on Monday, we have a good recommitment and many hooks that we can take out of the GA into our countries well prepared with our country teams and RCs to support governments to get the work done. The third is, of course, for us, that fresh momentum and mobilization. We expect to see that from our stakeholders because they will come in, and it includes the private sector. We expect to see early movers in some key areas and strong partnerships, because we're putting initiatives out there that need to happen on transitions for energy, for the digital era that we are facing now, for food systems, education, the social protection flaws that need to be attended to, and of course inequalities, particularly with women, young people, and the climate agenda. So we would like to think that we are going to have big commitments to grow the movement, but also to grow the investments for the goals, making sure that we double down on implementation.
Thank you so much. Let me now give the floor to Achim Steiner, the administrator of the UN Development Program.
Thank you very much, and thank you, DSG. You have laid out the menu and, in a sense, the venue. And I want to begin with that because sometimes the SDGs are projected onto the UN as if it is the responsibility of the United Nations Secretariat, agencies, funds, and programs to implement the SDGs. I just want to remind you that in 2015, it was 193 sovereign nations that voted, adopted, and took it upon themselves to implement the SDGs. So first of all, as you come to this week here and as the United Nations hosts the SDG Summit, it is not a way of saying, have we delivered as the UN? No, have we been able to deliver as a world community? Now, in the last few days, I've met quite a number, and I'm sure you as well, DSG representatives from the media, and many of you are saying, oh, I'm really struggling with my editors. The SDGs, they don't seem to be interested. It's a story of setbacks, of failures. Well, yes, we've just had an unprecedented pandemic. We have lived through a year with more wars and conflicts since 1945. We are in an economic global crisis. It's the targets and indicators that are experiencing setbacks. But I think what you will see at this halftime summit is not the walking away from the goals. I think on the contrary. Now, you might say that is wishful thinking on the part of us in the United Nations. But let me tell you, just yesterday, President Lula established a new commission for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals in Brazil. Just 10 days ago, or less even, the G20 summit under the leadership of the Indian presidency focused a great deal of its G20 presidency precisely around the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals. At the G20 meeting, the leaders endorsed another critical piece of work that the Secretary-General has been articulating for over a year now, which is that essentially the financing dimension that you just referred to is encapsulated in an SDG stimulus framework that is meant to draw the world's attention to something that we also often forget. The SDGs are not the goals of the developing world. They are co-equally owned and an obligation on developed and developing countries. It's the first time, in fact, that in the development agenda we have had such a universal commitment to goals. And as you just heard from the DSG, yes, we are not doing too well in addressing what is the lifeblood of any capability of a government to implement the SDGs, which is financing, the ability to invest. Instead, many countries are having to use their precious, already fiscally distressed public budgets to service interest rates and not the ability to invest. So my key message to you is, the temptation is, yes, to say the SDGs, they are at half-time, they haven't changed the world, turned it upside down, therefore, are they losing relevance? I think you would be wrong. I think it would be a misjudgment. Take a look at what is happening on the ground. I yesterday had a delegation from Japan. In Japan, the SDGs remain a central reference point for the future strategy of Japan as a society and economy. It's called Japan 5.0. I could take you to the Africa Climate Summit that just was hosted by Kenya in Nairobi, bringing together African nations to articulate a way forward that doesn't just take SDG 13, but takes SDG 7, SDG 1, and creates a vision of how Africa can actually drive its own development in an era of climate change. Let me end with just one more point. UNDP a couple of days ago, and you kindly came to the launch, presented to you 95 country insights, which essentially try to tell the story of the SDGs from the vantage point of 95 countries, where they've gotten to, where they've had setbacks, where they are currently thinking about how to move forward and what their options are. The thing that we drew from that was a very powerful message. The development we want is not feasible right now. Instead, we have to take the growth we can get. And it is at that interface between sustainable development, the 2030 agenda, and the harsh economic and fiscal realities that the future of the SDGs will play out. And how we as an international community can come together is going to be fundamental to either moving forward or not. So the SDG stimulus plan that the Secretary-General proposed, that the G20 acknowledged, and that is also in the political declaration here, is actually a key reminder of what is a priority right now. And to those who say, you know, the last years have just been setbacks, I quote you one fact from 2 days ago. The ITU just published the number for internet connectivity. 2005, 1 billion people. 2015, 3.2 billion people, I think it was, when the SDGs were adopted. As of the end of last year, 5.3 billion people. We just take it for granted that 2 billion more people now have internet access. This is also the story of the SDGs in the midst of extraordinary crises, pandemics, wars, conflicts, and geopolitical tensions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me now give the floor to Selwin Hart, the Special Advisor to the SG on Climate Action.
Brilliant.
You have the floor.
Good morning, and really great to see all of you. And DSG, thanks so much for your continued leadership. We would not be able to do all that we do without your leadership. And the reality is that we are at an extremely critical moment in our fight against the climate crisis. Earlier this year, we saw the alarming findings of the 6th assessment report of the IPCC. It clearly shows that we are way off track from meeting the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. And that 1.5 degree goal is not some arbitrary number. It means real things for people and livelihoods, especially those on the front lines of the climate crisis. We've seen over the last few months, as the DSG just stated, unprecedented and escalating climate impacts on every continent, in every region, and in every country. So at just 1.1 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, we are witnessing a scale of impacts that are unprecedented, and often those who have contributed the least are paying the heaviest price. So we are at a moment where it is absolutely clear that we need to do things with great urgency. One, accelerate the pace of decarbonization to keep the goals of the Paris Agreement within reach. This means accelerating the pace of decarbonization in key countries. The G20 accounts for 80% of global emissions. as well as key sectors, energy, industry, and other high emitting sectors. And secondly, we need to urgently deliver climate justice to those on the front lines of the climate crisis, which means ensuring that long-standing promises on finance are delivered, ensuring that priority is placed on adaptation and resilience building. At present, adaptation represents a mere fraction of the climate finance mobilized, and those that need it most, countries in Africa, the small island developing states, and the least developing countries don't have access to this much needed climate finance. You know, 6 out of every 10 Africans don't have access to an effective early warning system. So climate justice must be a priority for the international community. So the Secretary-General is convening this Climate Ambition Summit on Wednesday, the 20th of September. And this Climate Ambition Summit will showcase what we're calling first movers and doers from governments, business, finance, local authorities, and civil society who are taking credible actions, implementing policies and plans to keep the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement alive and deliver climate justice to those on the front lines of the climate crisis. So these credible first movers and doers from governments, the expectation is that leaders will respond positively. Some leaders will respond, or leaders will respond positively to what the SG has asked under his acceleration agenda, which was presented a few months ago and which was detailed in the letter of invitation he transmitted to leaders. We will also showcase credible first movers and doers from businesses, financial institutions, and local authorities who have put in place transition plans that are aligned with the recommendations coming from the Secretary-General's high-level expert group on net zero that was chaired by the former Environment Minister of Canada, Catherine McKenna. These transition plans have interim targets. They cover all emissions in the value and supply chains of these entities, and these transition plans will also have attached to them how these countries intend to invest in a just transition. And finally, the summit will also showcase what we're calling implementation partnerships. As the DSG said earlier, we have all the tools to solve this crisis. What we need is consolidation, collaboration, and cooperation among countries and financial institutions and businesses to solve some of these big challenges around decarbonization and climate justice. So, as I said, this is a summit where we hope to see credible and concrete action. We want to see credible and concrete implementation partnerships. As I said, it is a summit for first movers and doers who are demonstrating that they are taking real action to accelerate the pace of decarbonization and deliver climate justice.
Thank you so much, Selwin. We will now turn to Navid Hanif, the Assistant Secretary-General for Economic Development at DESA. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thanks to the DSG, Achim, and Selwin. I will just focus on a few aspects which were not covered by speakers in detail, previous speakers. This summit is also being perceived globally as a summit on the means of implementation. Commitment is there, goals are clearly defined, targets are available to measure performance, but we are lacking the means to implement. And let me unpack for you quickly. In a world where half of humanity, 3.3 billion people living in countries who spend more on debt servicing than on education and health, how do you expect them to invest in the SDGs? That's a big question looming for this summit to address. It's not just that they should be given resources from external channels that they need to invest. They also want to mobilize resources domestically. But Africa is losing $88 billion a year due to illicit financial flows, which is 3.7% of its GDP. Don't give aid to Africa, just let them keep their resources, and they will show you how to invest in the SDGs. That's also a question on the table for leaders to address. How do we fix the systems that allow this? It also involves corruption, but it also involves tax regimes, custom regimes, and whatever global incentives are given for investment. So financing for development is a key means of implementation. SG has announced, Achim mentioned the SDG stimulus, and that is one of the challenges he has identified at the top of the list to be addressed, plus affordable long-term loans to these countries to invest in the SDGs. Second part of means of implementation is, of course, trade. Protectionism is going up. Trade, especially, is not giving the opportunities for developing countries to export and gain access to these markets. And those trends will eventually, in the long term, impact their growth prospects. Foreign direct investment has gone down by 11%. So these are means which are missing. Third is technology. Achim just mentioned 2 billion people have come into the fold of using internet. 2.6 billion people are still out of the pool, and digital economy is growing twice the size of physical global GDP. And 2.6 billion people don't have access to the internet. Lastly, and most importantly, these countries need capacities. People and processes have to be improved. Institutions have to be given the capacity to implement the SDGs. So the message for this summit is significant steps have been taken, but let's not forget 15% are on track, reversal or slowing down. So incremental gradualism will not work. It's time for radical transformation in providing means of implementation and global commitment to advance the SDGs. No incremental steps will do the magic for reversing this trend in the next 7 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will now open the floor for questions. Let me do just a little bit of housekeeping first. We have 2 colleagues on each side of the room with the roving microphones. When you ask your question, please identify yourself and also tell us who you would like to address your question to. Let me start with Valeria.
Thank you so much, Valeria Robeco from ANSA Newswire, but I want to thank you for this press conference on behalf of ANCA. My question is to the Deputy Secretary General. So, how strong are your hope to be back on track for 2030 to reach, if not every goals, at least a number of goals? Thank you so much.
I'm very hopeful. I'm hopeful because what we've seen in recent times is that there is an engagement by the international community at the highest levels to the SDGs. There was not this even just a couple of years ago. Maybe we would say COVID, but frankly, for the G20, to have a whole year that is debating and discussing the SDGs as a whole, whether it's health or education, the economy, and to come out with a statement that reinforces one of the biggest challenges that we see, the means of implementation in the SDG stimulus. So that gives me some hope. Better still is the political declaration. If adopted, it has the hooks there for us to carry that forward back into countries. Now, I'm hoping that we're going to hear this not just at the SDG summit, but at the UNGA as well, that in the General Assembly, in the general debate, we will also hear strong paragraphs and references to how people are going to move forward with this. We've had huge numbers who are coming for the weekend, particularly from the private sector, who are mobilizing resources and showing where things have been done, but they do need to be taken to scale. I think we're very clear where some of the barriers are, and we can go after them, and we will, having got now the traction, I would say, of those who have the resources to go forward as some of our initiatives like the SDG stimulus.
James Bay.
James Bayes from Al Jazeera. Deputy Secretary-General, I have two questions for you. One, a substantive one on SDGs. But first, I'm sorry, I live up to my reputation of asking you difficult questions. We're in a very beautiful room. You've managed to create a garden inside a tent, which is inside a garden. But how much did this cost? Because, you know, behind us, UN headquarters, one of the best equipped conference centres in the world, lots of conference rooms that are bigger than this room, and we keep hearing the UN is cash-strapped, doesn't have money for food rations, cutting them in places like Yemen and Syria. Why pay for this?
Well, the UN didn't pay for it, its partners did. And I think what they put in place here was very much a need to find another space that other stakeholders could come into that can't always come into those wonderful spaces that you talk about. It's a general debate. It is government coming together, member states, and that fills up that space very quickly, and we are left with 1 or 2 seats for our stakeholders.
So how much did it cost?
Just over 3 million, I believe. Let me say something else. Even in that cost, some of this goes back to the community. Those doors that you see, the 17, go back to the schools in the community in New York, and all these plants go back into the parks, and they are replanted.
Okay, so my question on the SDGs, we had the G20 summit just days ago in Delhi. You got on some of the things you want, like global debt and reform of the international finance systems, which are all related, as Achim Steiner said, to the SDGs. You've got words, but no concrete action. Do the G20 countries really need to step up this week here in New York?
They absolutely need to step up. They should have done so yesterday. We are 7 years late to stepping up to the commitments made in Addis. What we see is some movement towards saying we will do that, but I think there are many frustrations, trust deficits around will that happen, will it not happen? I think for us, as I said, what is positive is that we have initiatives that the UN has put forward, and that we will follow up with those that are responsible for trying to make this happen. Be it that we want to find an additional rechanneling of $100 billion that could leverage through the multilateral development banks the $500 billion that we're talking about, or that we actually look at the debt restructuring to see that it's not working in the framework that is there, but can we move towards that happening? The evolution roadmap for the World Bank, how revolutionary is that going to be? I think that we have still the Marrakesh meeting coming up, and we hope the discussions here, particularly in the financing for development, can move elements of that forward.
So we will go to Carrie Newton, then Ibtisam, then Yvonne, then we will take some more questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the conference. I'm Carrie Norton from Le Monde. This is a finance question. Last June in France, a new pact for global finance has been introduced by Emmanuel Macron, but only 33 countries have endorsed it so far. How come it has not been endorsed by more countries? Is there a need for another document? And are you planning to introduce a concrete document next week? Can we expect, what kind of concrete engagement, concrete product can we expect next week?
Okay, let me say just a couple of things. First of all, the meeting in Paris was very welcome to create momentum and to bring leaders together. Did they all come? No. But what we did hear there were very frustrated voices at how do we take these words into action. A very difficult time to get something on paper that carries forward commitments. But we did see, with what we took this SDG stimulus, the Bridgetown Initiative, elements of that coming out in the G20 declaration. And that's, I think, what we want to keep fire under the feet for through the financing for development into what we will hope to meet in the annual meetings and later in COP on climate financing. Let's not forget that we've got some commitments there. But more credibly, financing for development doesn't produce for us another agreement. I would say we have one. We have the SDG 2030 agenda. We have the Addis Ababa agenda. These are all commitments that are made and signed off on. So we need to take those elements of action and implementation and keep reinforcing what needs to be done on that. But perhaps, I don't know, Navid, you want to add to that?
I think you have answered. Let me clarify. Next week, when the summit document is adopted on Monday, it has very clear steps to follow up. You don't expect leaders to go into the details, but there'll be a plan to make sure those steps are executed in time for the October meeting and what follows.
There is also commitments by President Macron, who has been very clear that what he could achieve in the commitments of Paris, how to carry them forward into these other meetings, and even the day before yesterday, reaffirming those commitments and how important it is to him
Thank
as
you.
a G7 member, important.
Ibtisam?
So.
Hi, thank you. My name is Ibtisam Azim from Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. I have two questions. The first one on the issue of whether you believe, when you now dealing with many world leaders, and when you look at facts on the ground, whether you believe that they really learned their lessons from the pandemic and the way countries dealt with it, and the way the UN also dealt with it. Do you believe that there is lessons, that things that should have been done differently, and what exactly are you going to do differently? The other issue is about this means of implementation. It's still not clear to me also here what else you want to do that you didn't do in the past, and in order to make sure that they are following on what they are promising. Thank you.
Maybe I'll leave the first question to Achim, but the second one on the means of implementation, what have we not done and we need to do differently? Implementation. We need to put our money where our mouth is. And we've tried to make it much easier to understand with a stimulus that speaks to ministers of finance on what exactly do you have to do. And I think here, we've even got into perhaps a little bit of pushback in, is this your job? Because you have the international financial system, you have IFIs that are supposed to be doing this. So I think if we've done anything differently, a step slightly forward, a little bit more forward, to push for those things to happen in the governance structures of IFIs, in the different ways with the existing institutions that you can bring more resources to it. SDRs is one example, but there are many.
Just to your question, what have we learned? I think the first thing that we learned is that very different choices happened during the pandemic. And that is why sometimes when we add up all countries, divide the numbers by 193, the averages mask very different realities. There were, in the way that governments set up, first of all, the response in terms of their health systems. And it was not always defined by whether you're a wealthy or a poorer country. Very different choices were made. Very different strategies of engaging the public were taken. Very different results emerged from that. The second was the kind of social safety nets that had to be put in place. We've had a debate about temporary basic incomes, or the kind of long-term debate about whether paying a minimum income to every citizen is something viable. During the pandemic, we saw an extraordinary, literally hundreds of millions of people receiving a temporary basic income. Countries did phenomenal things in a matter of weeks. Digital connectivity, the ability to actually deliver to people the means by which they could survive the lockdowns. So I don't want to take more time right now, but the story of the pandemic is not a story of averages. It is a story of choices, of very different policies, and the ability to have the resources to do something. If you're a wealthy country, you could spend billions or even trillions on short-term fiscal stabilization measures, social safety nets. If you were a wealthy country or had the right connections, you could be the first in line to buy vaccines, as opposed to having to get into the back of the queue. So we have learned a lot as the United Nations. Countries have learned a lot. The story of the pandemic really is there are different choices to be made, and you can extend that to the SDG discussion right now. Please do take to heart my message that I think we all are bringing to you. The SDGs is not a story of failure. But in 2015, we did not plan for a world with a global pandemic, nor for the kind of economic reality we find ourselves in right now. And again, within different countries, there are remarkable things that have been done in terms of poverty reduction. And again, I mentioned the UNDP Insight reports. The interesting ones are the outliers. The general statistics show setbacks, greater poverty, more hunger. But then there are dozens of countries who actually didn't face that. And it wasn't because they were the wealthier nations alone. They took different measures, different pathways. So our role as the UN development system, as UNDP, is to constantly learn and allow countries to study these experiences because they shape public policy, they shape public investment strategies. And from that point of view, I think it is important that we do not project, in a sense, a dead-end perspective. The world will go on. People will have to go on. Our role is to help them recover their balance, recover the momentum, and this is why the SDGs are so central to this year's events here in New York, because we have lost momentum and we are in danger of losing the SDGs as the only agenda right now that 193 nations have signed up to as an acknowledgement that they actually depend on each other. Thank you.
Thank you. We still have a lot of questions, so let me go to Yvonne, then I will come back at the front to Michelle Sherwin.
Thank
then
you.
Second row, and then we'll take more from this side of the room.
Thank you very much. Yvonne Murray, RTE News. My question is for Deputy Secretary-General. Thank you very much for this briefing. My question is regarding the negotiations on the SDGs political statement, long and torturous by all accounts, but one particular question with regards to language on sexual and gender-based violence and reproductive rights, which many countries objected to having included, and therefore the language ultimately was dropped. How concerned are you that that language had to be dropped from the political statement to be delivered next week?
Always extremely concerned when we drop any language on sexual reproduction and health rights, anything to do with women. But what's clear is that we have a framework that we don't walk back from. And in that framework, we have all those targets, and we have the commitments through different CSW commitments from member states to have our hooks in. It is one of the areas of concern that we see women's rights regressing. This is 75 years after signing the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. We have to double down on that. We see that the SDGs, if achieved, rights are served and delivered. The leave no one behind is not just a three-word sentence that we take lightly. And so we will continue to push for that. There have been gains, particularly in gender-based violence. The Spotlight initiative that we had across many countries, 3-4 regions now, is one that the SG is calling with the European Union for an increase and a broadening of that base for financing, and we're already seeing people lean forward on it. So there is the one thing to get a declaration out of a negotiation in very tense circumstances, and there's another thing for the things that we are still pushing in parallel to get out of different constituencies, different governments to move ahead on these issues. Really important. We're also digging down into the learnings of how we all came together in the response to COVID was much better joint planning, much better understanding that if we all get together on food systems and education and health, and these designs are done to target women, you don't need all those projects for women that amount to us, ticking a box. This is really a metric that shows that the outcomes in many of the investments could be better. It is a big learning that we had, I think, of how important. We've said it a lot, but we did it in the response to COVID. I mean, for me, in that political declaration, the biggest learnings is that still there are massive injustices in the discussion around the distribution of wealth. This has to happen in a way in which those that have understand the implications of taking away from those that really don't have. And more is being taken away. You've heard here that we're paying more in debt servicing than the money that we put towards children who have to get back into school, or health that has to be served, or women's rights at the end of the day that have to be delivered.
Michelle?
Thank you for the briefing. Michelle Nichols from Reuters. DSG, there's a lot of discussion ahead of next week about whether the presence of the Ukrainian president might sort of take away a lot of the headlines, suck the air out of the room. And there's also a lot of discussion about the big power rivalry as they try to possibly woo the global south to maybe keep them on side for either support for Ukraine or other issues. Are you noticing a sort of reinvigorated effort by big powers on the SDGs possibly as a result of that? Or are you also noticing any kind of pressure on governments from the next generation to implement the SDGs. I heard of a little 6-year-old friend of mine yesterday who's learning about the SDGs at school this term. Administrator Steiner, a question for you. You made a great remark at an event the other night, which was sadly off the record, about the importance of next week and what sort of goes on behind the scenes in terms of people running into each other and communication. And I was hoping you might be able to repeat that here for the cameras. Because it was a really good comment.
I hope he hasn't got short-term memory loss of the age that we have. But to your question, really important. As we had those tensions about whether it was climate or it was development, I think no one has that discussion anymore. Development includes climate. The war in Ukraine has to stop. And there's a lot of pain and loss. Education, it's a SDG. Health, it's an SDG. So I don't see them as separate, but I do see that in a political arena, that yes, oxygen gets sucked out of one room into another room because of the urgency of the responses that are needed. What I hope is that in all of the rooms, the consensus at the end of RGA is that these are all important matters. There are first things first. Any conflict has to be ended. You've seen the conflict in Sudan. You've seen what that has done to a country like Chad, so generous with so little, and something has to be done there. So yes, we see, as President Zelensky comes into the room, there will be a lot of attention there. But we also see that at the climate summit, for which we have to deliver in COP28, because that is also a halfway mark, that there is enormous interest in wanting to present what everyone is doing. So I think our pushing on all sides for people to see it is not one or the other. It's all of it, and it's hard because these are very many difficult issues that are brought into the UN. We can't always solve every one of them, but we can hope to close that gap. I have other concerns. I'm really glad that everyone's bringing this into the GA, and it's complicated, and we're trying to, how do you schedule it that it doesn't all crash together? But it's better that it's happening here than what we were seeing in months before, where everyone was going into their echo chambers and meeting in different parts of the world, because that for them was, music is what they were hearing. But frankly, that was not the reality. The reality is here. It's messy. We have to get solutions. We have to come closer together to solve those problems. And I'm as much as we are challenged by it, we're also hopeful that perhaps this is the place when you've got these face-to-face meetings that we can bring more solutions to it all. Yeah. What did you do? Remember? I gave you some time.
I'm sorry, I can't remember. And, since it was off the record, it has to be off the record. But maybe, which event was it? Oh, right. This last one. Those were very much off the record remarks because I jumped in for my dear Deputy Secretary General.
No, sorry to raise it, but I figured it was you were kind of talking about just the importance of the communication that happens here, maybe accidentally.
Now, let me just compliment, because what the Deputy Secretary General just said, I think is often difficult for people who sit somewhere in the world, watch the evening news. Maybe they'll see, a short snapshot of their president, their prime minister standing in front of that green marble podium and speaking. I think you made an interesting question just now, and my appeal would be to see the visit of a president such as President Zelensky as an integral part of many things happening in this building. I think, frankly, will it take the oxygen out of other meetings only if the media seizes only that story? I mean, you are the window between what happens in this compound with literally thousands of people, hundreds of meetings happening simultaneously, and the world out there. And I think what I maybe alluded to yesterday, we will have 140 heads of state, we will have 400 plus ministers, we will have thousands of stakeholders here. This is the place that people often say or question, is it still relevant? Is multilateralism still relevant to the situation we find ourselves in? Well, I think, first of all, the numbers speak for themselves, and people will say, oh yes, but aren't all the P5 not coming this year? This is the organization where 193 member states are members. That General Assembly Hall, and I always say that with true passion, is the symbol of what it means to have an organization where every country has a voice. You can be as small as you might be. You have the same number of chairs and a desk in that General Assembly Hall. That is why so many conflicts, so many unresolved tensions come to New York at this moment in time because they find a space that no other organization, no other building in the world provides, where you can begin to talk to each other again. So yes, there is a lot of talk that happens here. But I always say it's a lot better to talk to each other than to start pointing weapons at each other or not to talk at all. And I think that is perhaps the spirit that I was alluding to yesterday. And in fact, our UN patron for the oceans is another example. Here is an individual who, out of his own motivation and passion, just swam down the entire Hudson River to be here on the opening of the UN General Assembly because he wants to draw attention to the importance of what is discussed here, to the future of people, planet, water, and the oceans. And we have thousands of people like that who are supporting us this week here and millions out there. So multilateralism is not dead, but we are struggling with the currents of our time.
Sherwin.
Sherwin Briceby, South African Broadcasting. I'll stay with you, Achim, Steiner. The SDGs also has a solution for short-term memory loss. SDG 3, quality health and well-being. But more broadly, back to kind of expand on Michelle's question in terms of the geopolitical divides that tend to suck the energy out of conversations around development. How are the SDGs doing in places like Mali, in places like Chad and Sudan and Ukraine? I mean, let's get specific. 15% is 15%, despite your optimism, despite the positive disposition you're seeking to present here. 15% is failure right now. So how are the SDGs being implemented in countries that are experiencing coups right now, in conflicts right now, the Palestinian situation? Are we going backwards in those countries?
Well, may I just give a quick, and then I'll leave it to you to answer, because my response to my dear friend would be, do you want to blame all of that on the SDGs and the 2030 agenda? No, I think what you're describing is a world disrupted, a world distressed, a world caught up in tensions that are not being resolved. So whether it is in the Sahel region, whether it is in Haiti right now, the situation. I mean, you can point to many disastrous contexts for people on the planet. The question is, what's the next step? I mean, do we kind of put the SDGs aside and say, well, we might have gotten the design wrong for finding answers? No, the point of this week's meeting here is to say, we have an agreement on the great challenges of our time. We converted them into goals for cooperation. Then we have to deal with the reality. I mean, a coup d'etat is the product of years of developments within that country. But let me also say the United Nations often is the only entity that doesn't walk away from those situations, because our commitment is to the people of Mali, to Burkina Faso, today to Libya, to Afghanistan, to Yemen, to Syria, despite very often being criticized for even being there, because we believe that out of every dark moment there has to be a way forward. And the SDGs are not some magic formula. They are, however, an intelligent way of thinking about how do you get out of sometimes the most desperate moments. And we believe that both in terms of a way of thinking about development and recovery and cooperation, they are very compelling. So it's not to pretend that the numbers do not show a lot of setbacks, but it's not all failure. And if all we talk about is failure with the SDGs, then I wouldn't be surprised if everybody says, well, why are we actually continuing to work with the SDGs? And I think this is where the DSG, the SG, we all are, in a sense, trying to find a way to navigate what are many stories, but ultimately on the back of the crisis of the last 3 years, enormous setbacks. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was thinking very seriously about how do you have a conversation with presidents that are facing very many realities and then say, well, I've come in with 17 SDGs. I don't think you come in with 17 SDGs. I think that you come in with those that relate to the situation that they're in to try to find an answer to it. So, I mean, our unconstitutional changes in West Africa today is goal 16. It's a failure of democracy. It's a failure of the social contract. That puts in place, and note, those coups that just happened were celebrated by people. That's not what happens normally, and you can ask me, I come from a country where we had coups. We did not celebrate coups, and we don't have them now. But today you see that, and I think it does then give us an opportunity to say to a country, well, if you're doing this transition back, as in Mali, you need to put these elements, which actually are reflected in the SDGs, but let's not call them SDGs. Let's carry what exactly the SDGs mean and start putting that back in as basic rights and responsibilities that they need to have in their systems. And it is providing frameworks now for discussion. It's the only framing that you take to a table where people don't disagree with. It's agreed, but to do it is a whole different thing. We use the SDG 16 to say, well, there's got to be mediation here. Who's going to do this mediation? How are we going to deal with this, and what's the entry point for it? In the case of Niger, there are sanctions that are there that are affecting people's livelihoods. They're affecting the hunger levels that we see there. There's no power to generate the hospitals for medicines. So what do we do about that? We still push on the humanitarian side to say, let's have a corridor here, while at the same time we're trying to find a way out of what has been an unconstitutional change. So any crisis we see, how can we find the headline? And maybe this is a question to you. How do we find the headline that utilizes the SDGs as a solution that we need to get momentum and some traction behind? Because, I mean, you matter, your pen matters. And I think that as you write these stories, it needs to reflect that there are solutions to this that need to save billions of lives. And you can help. I mean, I'm always facing the questions from the media, but question to you, how do we get the headline that really does put fire under leaders to say that, look, there's solutions here, they're called these SDGs, there may be 17 of them, but are we moving towards that? And what's the reason why you are not dealing with people going to bed hungry in your country?
Thank you. So we will take your question, and then we have a group of visiting journalists, I understand, on this side. I would like to give you one question, maybe to you after, and then we will wrap up.
Hi there, Jimmy Quinn with National Review. Thanks for the briefing. So the Taiwanese government has said that they want to participate in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. Taiwanese nationals and passport holders and journalists aren't currently allowed onto UN premises. Madam DSG, do you believe that Taiwan's exclusion from the UN under the current guidelines hold back implementation of the 2030 goals?
I think exclusion of anyone holds back the goals. We said leave no one behind, and I think member states have to find a way to make sure that we are not in that position where we're excluding people. Every person matters, whether it's Taiwan or otherwise, and I think it's really important for member states to find a solution to that.
Thank you. Final question to, here you go.
Thank you. Damilala Banjo, DAG Fellow. I have two questions, one to Deputy Secretary General and the Special Advisor on Climate Action. One of the lines of conversations that I've noticed, and one that the Deputy Secretary General mentioned earlier, is that different continents and countries within this continent have different interests and needs. As such, they require varying means to achieving the SDGs. In Nigeria, for example, 700,000 children under the age of 5 are at the risk of severe acute malnutrition. This number is more than doubled last year. Another 4.3 million are hungry. How can African countries, particularly Nigeria, move closer to achieving this goal as we approach the second half of the target? What should the continent be doing differently? My second question on climate. Countries in Africa, Asia, Middle East rely on fossil energy for economic development. How do you market clean energy to these countries whose sole or predominant revenue generation come from crude and coal? Thank you.
Great question from our DAG fellow. Look, the indices for Africa country by country are appalling on health, on education. I would say in my own country, Nigeria, education's in crisis. We're not only getting teachers that have not been invested in, having the poor levels of teaching, but just millions of children that are either being left behind or even when they come out of school don't have the right. I think the new government has a huge challenge to try to put in policies that will strengthen from the local government and states up. We need to make accountable in Nigeria the 3 tiers of government. They've all got responsibilities for this. The 700,000 children that you're talking about is a local government and state responsibility. Now we can provide the enabling policies for that, but in the end, the resources and the implementation will have to come from there. Now, can Nigeria afford at the very basic level education and health and nutrition for children? Yes, it can. But at the current moment, when there are many asks of the resources on Nigeria, it makes it very difficult. And I think that they will need to look at the way they handle their tax base, the way they handle the efficiencies in government between the three tiers to get that done. The international community has to respond because they will, even with the best will in the world in Nigeria, there'll still be a deficit. And that deficit needs to come from a means of implementation, whether we're talking about trade and the barriers and therefore the disruption of some of the supply chains that have happened that we found difficult and expensive to recover. They will come from financing, whether we will continue to be able to hold the line on the debt that we have to repay. I think in the case of Nigeria's domestic debt, so a little easier, not much more easier to deal with. Technology, how fast we can move with that. Many of the things that Achim talked about with technology have provided an opportunity to leapfrog many things that we would have otherwise taken decades to do. Access to education, e-commerce, and Nigeria has a huge population that can move in leaps and bounds on that.
Thank you. And it's a great question, and it is a question that is at the heart of global efforts to address the climate crisis. We know the use of fossil fuels is the main cause of the climate crisis. And, you know, coal, oil, gas, it is absolutely clear that if we are to stand the fighting chance of limiting warming and protecting people in the developing world from the ravages of the climate crisis, we need to accelerate the global transition away from fossil fuels. But it must be just, fair, and equitable. And it must take into consideration the needs of the developing world. And what does this mean in very practical terms? It means that periods for transition for developing countries will need to be longer. And it means that the developed countries who have the capabilities, the capacities, the resources, they need to speed up their transition. So goes back to one of the questions earlier on the role of the G20. All G20 countries are not equal. And it is extremely disturbing that you see advanced economies among the G20 who committed to net zero, who committed to ambitious indices, are now issuing new oil and gas licensing at a time when the IEA, the IPCC, and others have clearly stated that this is incompatible with the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. And the same countries are then trying to lecture the global south on precisely the issue that you raise. So this is at the heart of what we're trying to solve here. How can we ensure that developing countries don't follow the same industrialized, dirty, polluting, industrialized pathway of the global north, that they are supported with finance and technology and capacity building really to undertake a just and a fair transition. And the Secretary-General, he has called for a global solidarity pact building on the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, the South African model, and I know you might have different views on how that is going, my friend, Indonesia and Vietnam, where countries are supported with finance and technology to accelerate their transitions away from coal. Right? We know that renewables are now cheaper than fossil fuels in many parts of the world. But you have, in many developing country situations, this high cost of capital. Africa, despite its enormous renewable energy potential, 60% of the solar capacity globally is in Africa. Africa accounts for a mere 2% of the global investments in renewable energy. A lot of it is because of the risk perceptions that many private investors have in Africa and other parts of the developing world. Same technology. If you're looking to make an equity investment in Germany, it's probably 3-4%. In Nigeria, it's 19%. Right? So we really have to solve some of these challenges and remove some of these obstacles. But to precisely answer your question, the transition must happen if we're to address this climate crisis, but it must be just, fair, and the time frames will need to be differentiated for different types of countries and different categories of countries.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our guests. We will wrap up now. And again, lots of events coming up. Just a quick reminder, the SDG Summit is Monday and Tuesday, the Climate Ambition Summit on Wednesday, of course, the general debate, and many, many more, and lots of information online. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and have a good day.
Transitions.